Oh my God, what am I doing? A writer at the New York Times named Adam Liptak believes that conservatives have weaponized the First Amendment. This is actually a shorter version of a video I did where I went through the article. Hello, my name is Desi-Rae, and this is my channel, Just Thinking Out Loud. First of all, I want to look at what is the First Amendment. Wikipedia. First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution prevents Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, or to petition for a governmental redress of grievances. It was adopted on December 15, 1791, as one of the 10 amendments that constitutes the Bill of Rights. It seems that the first time that it was instituted, it was for the protection of religious expression. So it's basically saying that you have the right to express your opinions. It was first done specifically to protect religious expression, but that is extended towards freedom of the press and freedom of any individual. I want to point out that the First Amendment doesn't talk about being liberal or conservative and does not point these things out and make that distinction as this author does. So the author starts off by talking about two court cases that were recently won by conservatives and recently approved by conservative judges in the Supreme Court. So there were 5-4 rulings where conservative judges were hearing the cases of conservatives who were using the First Amendment in order to say that what they were being asked to do was a suppression of their First Amendment rights. The two cases that they specifically mentioned were one where labor unions were forcing people to pay their dues in order to pay for their collective bargaining, but that there are people who obviously do not want to pay those dues, so they shouldn't have to, and that was a violation of their First Amendment rights. I personally believe in that. I believe that if I don't want to put my money towards a certain union, I should not be forced to. If I don't want to have the protection of this union or have my wages fought for, then that should be my decision. And that to me is very clearly an issue of freedom of speech and where your money goes. The second case was about clinics who did not want to have to provide information about abortion to people because they were religious clinics who were not in favor of abortion. I personally, again, agree with this issue. To me, these are very clear-cut cases, and these are just the first arguments that the article opened with, that there were these recent court cases where conservatives were using the First Amendment in order to state their arguments, to claim their right to whatever they wanted to do. I want to point out that there are some people who are specifically arguing about money being used as freedom of expression when they don't believe it is. Again, I personally believe it is. I think you can make the argument that a corporation isn't a person, so the corporation shouldn't be able to vote for certain things through using their money, but that's different, and that doesn't apply to these first two cases. And even though they start out with these two cases, their actual argument was about the current Supreme Court having conservatives win cases more often than in the past. And they showed this graph where they talk about the current Chief Justice Roberts hearing more conservative cases and those cases winning than in the past. That actually seems to be their core argument here, that they're saying that there has been a shift towards conservatives using freedom of speech, i.e. the First Amendment, in order to argue and win, I suppose. So it's very obvious to me the hypocrisy of this. They're basically saying that the left used to argue for freedom of speech and use that to protect groups that needed protecting, and now they're saying that these groups are being harmed. So they give some quotations from various law professors, most of them saying that free speech is no longer being used to protect people who it's supposed to be protecting. One of these quotes is from Professor Seidman, who's a law professor at Georgetown University. The first quote of this law professor in this article is, "When I was younger, I had more of the standard liberal view of civil liberties, and I've gradually changed my mind about it. What I have come to see is that it's a mistake to think of free speech as an effective means to accomplish a more just society." So he's basically stating that he sees free speech as a tool to accomplish his version of a just society. That's what I read from that statement. But let me go to, I think, the core argument that they're making, which is that they can no longer use free speech to defend the groups that they believe need protecting, and that free speech has now been co-opted by people who want to harm those groups, and this is their opinion. To Professor Seidman, cases like these were part of what he described as a right-wing takeover of the First Amendment since the liberal victories in the years Chief Justice Earl Warren led the Supreme Court. With the receding of Warren Court liberalism, free speech law took a sharp right turn, Professor Seidman wrote in a new article to be published in the Columbia Law Review. Instead of providing a shield for the powerless, the First Amendment became a sword used by people at the apex of the American hierarchy of power. Among its victims, proponents of campaign finance reform, opponents of cigarette addiction, the LGBTQ community, labor unions, animal rights advocates, environmentalists, targets of hate speech, and abortion providers. The title of the article asked, "Can free speech be progressive?" The answer, the article said, is no. There are a couple of things I want to point out. The first part being free speech law took a sharp right turn. That's the main argument of this whole article, is that if you're looking at the courts through the decades under different chief justices, there has been a shift from liberals using free speech to argue what they want to argue for to conservatives using free speech or the First Amendment in order to argue for what they want to argue for, and that they are now winning. All of this sort of seems like whoever is writing this article is sort of butthurt, and they clearly believe that free speech is only for what arguments they think are important. So it's not about the principle in itself, it's about what that amendment can be used to do. So how can they advance their version of the best society, or the kind of society that they would like to live in. So it's not about the principle, it's about them being able to use it as a tool to advance their agenda. I think that's very clear. I'm not sure how you could argue that when they're making this about who is winning using the First Amendment, not whether or not the First Amendment applies to what they're arguing for. That's not what this is about. It's simply talking about First Amendment being employed by people who have ideas that they don't agree with. So that was the first thing I want to point out. The second thing I want to point out is that instead of providing a shield for the powerless, so the First Amendment to them is a way to provide a shield for the powerless. That's what they think the First Amendment should be, for protecting groups, not for the individual. And this is the thing about the left. They are all about groups. They're not about the individual. And then the third thing I want to point out is that these victims, opponents of cigarette addiction, campaign finance reform, LGBTQ, community, labor unions, animal rights advocates, environmentalists, targets of hate speech, abortion providers, there is no acknowledgement of the fact that there could be animal rights advocates, environmentalists, targets of hate speech, whatever that means, abortion providers, labor unions, like people who are forcibly forced into labor unions, and LGBTQ communities. I don't know about opponents of cigarette addiction. I don't really hear about those people, or proponents of campaign finance reform, that those people agree with them. So this person is basically saying that we want to shield you people from these, I guess, hateful arguments being made by people on the right or conservatives who are using the First Amendment in order to protect their right to say these horrible things. There's no acknowledgement, as always, I see this again and again, of the fact that there are people within these groups who might not agree with your take on the issue. So you can't just say you're speaking for them. So that's the third thing that I wanted to point out. So that's what I thought about this article. The left basically thinks that the First Amendment only applies to them. I don't know if I should say the left, but this writer and many of the law professors in this article, and this person who has this quote at the end, Justice Kagan, who says that conservatives are turning the First Amendment into a sword, and says that speech is everywhere, a part of every human activity, employment, healthcare, securities, tradings, you name it, this is written. For that reason, almost all economic and regulatory policy affects or touches speech. So the majority's road runs long, and at every stop are black-robed rulers overriding citizens' choices. I think this is amazing. This is amazing. We aren't winning anymore, so we're going to take away the thing that we used and we thought was perfect when it was aiding and abetting us. But now, when you want to use this thing, you can't have it anymore. What utter, stunning hypocrisy. I'm not surprised. Their main argument is that there has been a shift over the years where there are no longer more liberals winning cases based on the protection of the First Amendment, but now there are more conservatives winning cases. So it doesn't matter if those cases are actually correctly using the First Amendment, it just matters that there are now less liberals winning and there are more conservatives winning. That is actually the argument that they're making, that there is now a problem with free speech because now conservatives are using it and they're winning. Not just supposed to be a shield for radicals and artists and activists. It's supposed to be something that belongs to the individual. It does not belong to specific groups, and it is not just there in order to create the society that you want to create that protects these groups. It is there because it is an individual right. And you can go and argue the roots of that right, but that's why it exists. Not just to protect the groups you want to protect, and not just to create the vision in society that you want to create. If you don't like something that someone is saying, then you should counter it. That's what you should do. And if someone else hears that argument and they don't agree with you, then you need to accept that. Or you could also try harder and make better arguments. But trying to remove a protection because the enemy is now winning, what? That's just not playing by the rules. Which is very obvious to a lot of people nowadays. This is the trend of no longer debating people, but just trying to silence their voices. And there are people in these groups that they claim to protect whose voices are also being silenced, such as mine. By the way, I am the target of hate speech. I get it on my channel all the time. There are people who attack me for whatever reason. There are racist people on both black and white people who attack me that come on my channel because of the arguments that I make. And I don't believe that that means that their free speech should be taken away. And I don't want someone out there arguing for that on my behalf when I've never told them that I wanted those things. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. I will talk to you soon. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click the bell. Don't forget to donate. Okay, bye. I'm telling you, sore losers. These people are sore losers.